Hey folks, welcome back to another deck collection video. Today we're jumping into my animal decks, which is one of the biggest parts of my collection. So there's a potential for this being split into two. I shall see how I get on. We're going to start with tarot. As you can see from the name, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek, the reason that it says people not advised is because in order to explore my decks in a manageable capacity, with animals being such a intrinsic theme in so many of them, these animal only decks are just that. There is actually a human depicted once or twice in one of the decks, tarot wise, and then the same with Oracle, but other than that, they are solely animal decks. Also, that brings me on to my second point, which is they're not mixed decks, and so the Wild Unknown is not in this category. For example, it was one that I sat with and thought about for a while, but that is going to go in my earthly deck collection, and the reason being is because there's so many cards in the Wild Unknown that aren't animals on them that it just doesn't feel inherently an animal deck in the way that these ones do, even though that was my first animal tarot deck, which is why I always think of it. But it is different from these decks, and that will show as I go through them. So that was really my thinking in regards to that. Although, like I said, most of these could go in the earthly decks, they could go in other categories. I don't need to bore you with my reasoning for too long. This is also where we really see how my tarot decks, whilst not a collector in the sense of collecting things that I don't feel drawn to use, turns more into a collection, in that because my interest and studies and hobbies around animals really expand outside of my craft and just infuse so many things that I do. That's another reason why it's the biggest portion of my deck collection. It's some of the fun ways that I integrate animal studies alongside the various books, and when I can get out in nature and all of those things that I consider fun. So this is a big one. This is the one where I'm not so tough on whether my decks stay or go, if that makes sense. If I feel like they're adding anything mildly to my animal interests, then I will tend to be a bit softer on them and how much I use them and allow them to stay in my collection. That being said, we're going to jump straight into the animal tarot decks, and yeah, we'll chat about them as we go. We're going to start with an out of print deck and get it out of the way with. This is the Animal Wires Tarot, I believe it's called. This is Ted Andrews' tarot deck, and it is the first edition printing because it did change slightly. However, sadly, both of them seem to be out of print, and I don't know if they'll come back, purely because obviously Ted Andrews is no longer with us. I really wanted this edition first and spent a long time waiting on trying to find a copy that I was, that was in my price range. I really like the other one as well, but I find this one more aesthetically pleasing, and some of the pictures are different, and again, I preferred them in this particular deck. I'd love to know why the photos were changed actually. Looking at the ones that aren't changed, the hues are completely different and the saturation is completely different in the two decks. And so I was really, really, really happy and kind of psyched to get this deck. It's an interesting one. The animal medicine is beautiful. And actually, I don't mind the key phrases that have been chosen down the bottom. But one of the things I do find from perusing through the book that comes with it, which is still a really great addition, is the animal medicine's on point, but sometimes Ted's view of the tarot cards, not how the animals fit into them so much, but just his general approach to said card doesn't necessarily quite align with mine, but it's at this stage not a big problem. It's just a beloved deck for me. I'm really into nature photography, I take my own, but I'm no I'm no photographer. But there's not really many photographic animal decks out there, and yes, I would love to make one, but time. I really love this deck. It's special to me in a way that it comes out for non-tarot purposes as well as tarot readings. And I will confess, whilst generally I'm not nowadays too precious about my decks, I would be very scared about taking this one into the wild, which is a shame, because I feel like that's where it's meant to be. But I genuinely would struggle to replace this. It would be almost impossible. So I would have liked the other version to take it out and about with me, but I do feel very lucky to have this deck, so I am particularly fond of it. This is the Animism Tarot, and it's not one that I see around too often, which does surprise me, but that just happens with some decks because it's existed for a while. This was the second ever deck that I was sent by someone who I had met through Instagram, which was really sweet. It's been out on wanders. It's been to the duck pond that people know me so well for. This one has a really lovely selection of animals in it. You don't see as many giraffes and cheetahs in the tarot decks as I do sort of in the oracles. So I appreciate that about this one. Whilst I don't like to tell people what is and isn't a beginner deck, I know people are going to ask. So as you can see, this is definitely 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗀𝗃 informed, but I will say of all of the animal decks that I own, whilst you can get a guidebook or a PDF for this, it's short and sweet, it's still lovely. If you don't even know enough about, I feel like more if you don't know enough about the tarot over the animal, then the depiction of what's going on isn't always as obvious. It isn't always as easy. And so it may not be the easiest beginner one, especially with the cults. That being said, I really enjoy the choices. I like how animals are on unexpected suits in this, so not all water animals, or water dwelling animals rather, are in the cup suit. It really branches out from that, again probably making it a little bit more challenging for people who are less familiar with the animals, but overall it's a really great deck. I enjoy it. I love the artwork. I enjoy that you can see the details and the layers of this particular style of art. I should probably take more photos of it, to be fair, but it's more of one of those ones that comes for walks with me and then I forget to take the photos. For anyone who's wondering, this next one is one that I would, and yes, there are some challenging depictions in it, one that I would recommend more so for people who are newer to tarot/animal world, and this is the Animal Totem Tarot. The depictions are slightly more obvious in their 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗃, I feel. There's a little bit more of the landscape and the scene in the background, just a tiny bit more going on than the Animism Tarot. But they are two that I have both spent a lot of time with and that have gone outside with me a lot as well. Also, this comes with a killer guidebook. It is a really freaking impressive guidebook. I have spoken about it on numerous occasions and I cannot recommend it more, because it does a bit about what the animal says, a bit about why the animal was chosen. It does a general meaning and essence of the card that you're working with. And then it has a 3-part breakdown. I think it's love and relationships, business-ish, it's not called business-ish, but and health and general well-being, I think, are the breakdowns. What that does is it helps people to learn how to view one card meaning through various different lenses, and that's freaking great. I feel like that's invaluable for beginners, because you get this meaning, and whilst it seems really set in its way, when you have all of these different reasons that you're coming to the cards, all of a sudden it can feel really abstract, and a book like that can really help. Aside from that, again, this has a really nice variation of animals. Probably some of the most unique animal tarot deck inclusions in this one. And this was one of the animal decks that really went there before some of the others that I really love. So I feel like this is a big player, and that somehow that goes forgotten sometimes. I don't know. Probably one of my favourite art styles as well. It has that sort of, I don't know what the term is anymore, but it's got that realism to it, whilst you can still tell that it's been drawn. Definitely one of my favourite decks. It's a lovely way to learn animals. It's a lovely way to further your tarot exploration and expand the way that you use your cards. I suppose I should have told you how I used the previous one, but you know, for everything, it's an all-rounder. But onto this one. This is the Oak, Ash and Thorn. You can see I've got a bit of a thing for animal artwork, especially when it's done so well. This beautiful deck has a different kind of approach, which you'll see in a few of them, where there's a set animal per suit. So it gives it a bit of a different vibe. The animals are the weavers of the suit and the embodiment of the suit's energy as a whole, as opposed to each animal being a representation of that specific card through an aspect of their medicine, energy, behaviour, whatever you want to call it. Definitely a different vibe, possibly an easier animal deck to read with for people who are newer to that or not looking to sort of learn all of the behavioural nuances of every single animal in a deck. And the reason that I fell in love with this one so much is because the animals are native to me, all of them. It was a beautifully eco-friendly creation as far as any deck creation can be anyway. And it reminds me of a few things that are really dear to my heart, but one of the things it reminded me of was the animals of 𝗪𝘁𝗄𝗏, which most people, if you're old enough to remember that, you'll know it was actually quite harrowing. They don't do that to children so much anymore. But it was a really profound, powerful program that had quite an environmentally political message that's unfortunately even more relevant now than it was then. But this deck really just brings back those memories. It's got the foxes in it, which if you don't know me, then foxes are a big deal in my world, especially all animals are, but I love foxes. This is a stunning deck. Very, very Rider-Waite-Smith. By no means a clone, but just in terms of it has its very firm footing in what it's doing. It knows what it's doing. That's how it's working. It's a very thick deck, which is why I'm struggling to hold it, so I'm sorry. But yes, beautiful nonetheless. Next up, we have one of the biggest players in my tarot collection, full stop, and that's the Brady Tarot, which if you look into the background, I have the first edition of as well. I don't do that too often, but for this deck, it had to happen. I know I haven't got it out and it's a deck collection video, but you know, it's the same artwork, just with an extra white border and smaller cards. I don't know how to describe my connection to this deck anymore. I didn't know if I wanted this originally when it came out. There are some difficult depictions, important but difficult depictions of some of the animals. One thing I could appreciate was the artwork, knowing how long it takes, especially in the layers that goes into it. There's a whole part of me that appreciates that entirely separate from the deck. But when I did get this, and obviously I started with the first edition of it, I fell in love really, really quickly. It's very honest about the animal world, and I appreciate that. Some of the other decks that I have are very fairy tale, very fantasy, almost have a Disney spin on them. There's nothing wrong with that. I appreciate those decks too, but this is representative of the way that I work with animals, the way that I study. I feel like Brady really brought that to the forefront and shows animal behaviour. Animals eating other animals, animal death overall. and encourages people to face animals that maybe are less commonly considered the cute and the fluffy ones that people want to work with. It's really interesting to see how our stereotypes of animals and the way that they've been portrayed in folklore and religion and various other capacities, how that has so much weight to it without people realising. It encourages us to see that this is animals being animals. It's our perception of them that deems their behaviour good or bad. You know, if an animal kills another animal, that's nature. They live in a completely different way to humans, and this is animals being animals at its very core. It's very clever. It's incredibly well thought out. I love that the proceeds support good causes. One of my absolute favourites. I mean, it really put my Wild Unknown Tarot on a bit of a bed rest when it had its first sort of year in my collection, and that was kind of a big deal at the time. So these videos should be called Watch Her Struggle with Holding These Decks, because they're either too heavy, too thick, too slippery. I'm like a Goldilocks. This is the Tarot Fauna. This is another one that goes back to that having animals for set suits. We also see foxes in the wands here. This has this very watery, soft, not that the other's not emotive, but this, especially some of the close-ups, it really gets into the animal's eyes. And I suppose there's a crossover between animals' version of expressing emotion and then humans' projection of that as well. But it does it so beautifully. It's such a magical deck. It often makes me smile or laugh when I pull some of the cards, and equally have had tears in my eyes at some of the others, which I feel like is pretty impressive because, you know, I know the cards, I know what they mean, but there's something about the depiction of this particular deck that hits me in the feels. It has 2 extra cards, which is always a fun bonus, and you can see that I do in fact keep those in the deck. But even though the animals are set per suit, again, there's a really interesting selection of them that brings something a little bit different than some of the others. I don't think there's a Black Widow in any of my other decks. If there is, it must only be one. And what a clever card to have it on as well. The Hierophant as the raccoon, very unexpected. I am very fond of the creator and the artist and the way that they brought this deck together. I watched it come together with utter glee the whole time of the process was shared, and it was really, really fun. So when I got offered a copy of this deck as a gift, I jumped at the chance, and I feel like it's one that did something different, especially with the majors and what was in them that we hadn't seen so much of. And if you have enough animal decks, you can say that, trust me. As much as it makes sense to have the bat in Hanged Man, because obviously bats hang upside down, and so their perspective of the world comes from a different point of view than our own, which is really interesting. But it's not the only aspect to bat. I'm sure that we could find many nuances to their behaviour and pop them in many different cards. So when someone feels a little bit outside of that or just changes it up, I'm always especially interested, and it catches my attention. But yeah, beautiful deck. Back to decks that have a different animal per card, and this is the Animal Wisdom Tarot, but someone told me that the name of this deck has been changed. It's still available and literally nothing else has changed, so I'm not sure why they changed the name, but the Animal Wisdom Tarot is what I know it as. And this might surprise some people just in terms of it being so dang cute and pastel and all of the things that maybe are less associated with me. But as I say, animal decks, people, animal decks. This is another one that actually comes with a really fantastic book that it still incorporates the animal's behaviour as well as how the creator perceives them, and I appreciate that because I think that they are two very different things. It's a little bit less that way inclined, or maybe a little bit more concise than the Animal Totem Tarot, but it still does it really well. And of course the imagery is really different, so if people were feeling that the cards in the Animal Totem is just too much, this is a far softer deck visually. I think most people would agree. For that reason alone, I think that it gives it a particular strength. I've never found the animals to be off. I've never found the messages to be off or lacking in any capacity. I mean, look, it's so cute, right? It's so cute, and yet the cuteness takes nothing away from it. And that's impressive to me, because I find that sometimes with cuteness, the depth isn't always there. And I'm sure that works across the board in very themed decks, that some of the darker decks that are out there, it's like, oh, this deck's dark, and then there's really nothing behind it. So I don't mean that just against cute decks, but certainly there are some particular styles and themes that tend to have less to them behind the artwork, I find, and so this is impressive in that way. Next up we have the Pacific Northwest Tarot, and this is quite a newish one to my collection. The creator reached out to me and offered me a prototype. Now this isn't my go-to art style, and I don't think that's going to surprise anyone. I'm not saying it's not freaking cute, because this is my favourite card. But it's not my go-to style. It was the way that they shared each card. They'd studied the animals, they shared intimate stories that either maybe involved the animals or just really represented the card's energy. It was a very personal, I almost want to say vulnerable, intimate experience that they were sharing. At least that's how I viewed it. And it was something about the creator and the way that they were carving out this deck that really drew my attention, if I'm honest. And so when they asked me, it really aligned with how I hope and how I envision that people come to deck creation across the board. And then of course, as someone who loves animals and has a lot of animal decks, then there's going to be like additional parts to that. So whilst it is a colourful deck, and because of the aesthetics, it's not always going to be the first thing I pick up, I do think that there was so much integrity that went into it, and it reads so well that it's still a very cherished animal deck in my collection. Now for the last 4 decks, we move into a whole different type of deck, which don't feel like animal medicine decks in the same capacity to me. So they're not what I go to learn or engage with specific animals, and that's simply because they are individual animals represented the whole way through. So this is the Crow Tarot, and just as it sounds, it is all crows. It is very much in the realm of the 𝗪𝗺𝗺𝗺 clone. It's very interesting because some of the cards feel almost chaotic's not the right word, but they're busy. They're very busy. But in person, it is kind of fun to sit and look at the layers. So getting it, I both loved and didn't love the artwork. I freaking love crows. I love collage art. And I've become quite fond of how the creators sort of developed. I love the look of the oracle deck that goes with this. I feel like that busyness was kind of left behind. The images feel clearer to me from what I've seen in that one. I would love it, but of course that didn't get picked up by US Games, whereas this did. But when I read with this, Seamless could easily replace my 𝗪𝗺𝗺𝗺. In fact, happily so, because as many know, it's not a secret, I'm just not a massive fan of the original, even though it's one of the systems I work with. I just don't like the artwork of the original, what can I say? It encompasses a lot of crow behaviour and crow energy really well. Some of it's really playful, some of it's got the more destructive element. I do feel like this bird is wearing these as a bra, which I fully appreciate, and it makes me chuckle every single time I see it. Sorry if that is now going to be stuck in your brain, but yeah, really interesting one, because I saw it and I just thought no. But yeah, it did surprise me, so I'm going to put it down before it drops. But the last three are all cat-themed tarot decks. Just a heads up if you're not a cat person. This is the Considerate Cat Tarot. This is my least used animal tarot currently, and for no other reason than it has a very heavy contender cat-wise that tends to be my go-to. So you're probably curious as to why I kept it. As I say, I'm much more chilled out about keeping my animal decks, and I really appreciate what the artist did, which was utilise a lot of people who had rescued cats and took their stories, obviously after asking, and embodied them in this beautiful world of cats. There are cats with different disabilities and different health challenges. It's diverse for a cat world, it really is. It's very adopt, don't shop. It's very whimsical, it's very sweet. I enjoy her artwork. She is a cat fosterer herself. So there's a lot of reasons why this deck is a special deck to me. It was on my wish list for the longest time, and a dear friend sent it to me as a gift. Look at this cutie. Earless and still as beautiful as ever. And their story, again, I believe can be found or is in the larger book. So if you're a cat person, this has got all of those extra special kitty vibes to it. This is the main contender that I was talking about. Tarot of the Pagan Cats. Hello, 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺 in cat form. This is the best deck in the world. This is my car deck, which means that it travels with me. It is everything that I would hope for a cat deck. It's got all the cat behaviour. It's got some slightly anthropomorphic / human-y stuff going on in the knights, but in a cheesy, fantastic way. I love the various animals that were chosen for the knights to ride. Mostly it's very obvious cat behaviour still, but then in this human realm. This, I've spoken about lots, is weird as fuck and hilarious. I don't know what happened with this one, but I'm so glad it did, because I've got such a bad sense of humour. Such a bad sense of humour. But yes. What can I say about this deck? It's so freaking heavily used. It gets bashed around. I have a backup copy of this for whenever it falls apart. I feel like if you are a cat person, but at all, then this deck is just going to make so much sense to you, and a really easy way to come away from people decks if you're feeling like you need a break from the people. And that's all I'm going to say about this one, because there are no more words. And last but not least, because I am going to separate the oracles because this video is getting long, is the Mystical Cats Tarot. This was my first cat tarot deck, and this is one of the ones that I got really early on when I returned to Tarot World. One of the things that this does beautifully is it renames the suits by the elements. It's got a really earthy vibe to it, very playful cat energy, and a little bit less humanized than Tarot of Pagan Cats in most ways, until you get to the cults and some of the majors where they're bejeweled and looking rather fancy. This was a deck that I learnt the 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺 with, and it did it really well. It wasn't a clone, so it encouraged me to stretch out of that, the well-known imagery pretty early on. But it's close enough to it that it really was a very, very helpful component in fleshing out the 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺 and bringing systems into an otherwise very intuitive, or sort of arguably their own system type of tarot decks that I had grown up using. And because I didn't know that cat themed tarot decks existed, and I came back to the world of tarot, and all of a sudden there was this Wild Unknown tarot deck, and then, oh my god, there's a cat deck. The cat woman had to have a cat deck. I have not been disappointed with this one. The book is very sweet. The creators are all very much cat people, which is a mega bonus, right? Because who do you want to create a cat tarot deck but cat people? No, I don't like picking a favourite, but although this was my first one, I used the other one more. This one also couldn't deal with being thrown in the car because of its cardstock. I love the cardstock, it's just not durable enough to throw, which my poor other deck does kind of get thrown around a little bit. But really gorgeous cat deck, lovely elemental vibe, and the final deck that I'll be showing. So that's all from the animal tarot portion, and I'll be coming back with all of the oracles because I have around the same amount of animal oracles as I do tarot, and so you can see it's going to be another lengthy video. So hopefully you'll be looking forward to that. If you've got any questions about the animal decks, what I will say is that whilst I've moved a lot of my animal focused content and teachable offerings onto Patreon now, I have done over the years videos about choosing the right animal deck for you, going through my animal decks, a few very basic introduction to animal medicine or animal guide or whatever you want to call it, working as well, and you'll be able to find those videos on my YouTube. They're all still up and public, so if you want some more of that kind of thing, there are some videos out there from me as well if you're not on my Patreon. Obviously, if you are, then you know there's a whole bunch more of even more in-depth stuff. But otherwise, like I said, if you have any questions about any of these particular decks, then let me know below as well. Thank you for hanging out with me again, and I'll see you in the next one.